Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of boards, recorder of videos, and a tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to the DM Roundtable for March 2022. This is a chance for patrons and I to get together and discuss topics in tabletop RPGs. By sharing our ideas, thoughts, and experiences, we can all become better DMs or GMs. The DM Roundtable discussions are open to all patrons at every level of patreon.com/roguewatson. You don't even have to be an active participant. You can jump in here and lurk to your heart's content. We are glad to have you. This month's topic, as determined by the Patreon poll, is survival and supplies. Managing limited resources could be an important feature in our games, or we could ignore them entirely. Do we track food and water, ammunition, weather, gear, and other supplies? And if so, how does that affect our campaign? Joining me for this month's DM Roundtable, we have Genocider.
Hello.
I fucking love that name also, for obvious reasons. Robert.
Hi.
Scalenia.
Hello.
And Stan.
Hello.
This is despite running a hex crawl campaign for 2 years. I don't have a whole lot of experience with, I guess, the extreme end of like literally tracking rations and surviving the elements and playing it like, I guess, like I picture those survival crafting video games. I really love that. What's the dinosaur one? The ones that like Dino Riders the game, Ark, I think. And it looks so cool in a trailer, and then you go in to play it, and you just start out like in your underwear, like bashing trees, and I just don't have time for that. And D&D, I like it because it's such a fun power fantasy, and I think that's why a lot of my group plays. And pretty quickly we realized that tracking that kind of stuff, and another example is tracking arrows. I hate when video games keep track of my arrows. I just, no. I hate it. Just let me fire all my arrows. And so I don't like doing that in D&D. And I get why I think it could work for some campaigns if that's how you want to run it and you're upfront about that. But honestly, from a default standpoint, I'm not even sure I like including a lot of those rules. But I am very interested in having this discussion and hearing from all of you. So Genocider, why don't you kick us off on your opening thoughts on basically tracking supplies in terms of surviving in the wilderness?
Yeah, I think you got it right. Like, you can do it, but you have to be upfront about it. And I think that has to be like kind of a focus on a campaign. Like the longest game I played was a Dark Sun,
Ooh.
second edition AD&D campaign, and just going from one town to another, you had to keep track of your water, because it was like a super hot desert.
Right.
So that was like part of the game, like an integral part of the game.
So what I know of Dark Sun, which is not much, is it's like if somebody took a fantasy world and turned it into like a post-apocalyptic Mad Max wasteland ruled by like God King mages or something, almost like Conan-y maybe. And yeah, so you'd have to track like water and shit just to be able to survive. That'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's about right. And like people would fight over like a oasis or pond in the middle of the desert. So it was like an important resource to track.
Were there mechanical consequences for running out of water, or was it more of a story thing?
Mechanical consequences, like you would dehydrate and die.
That counts.
Just going from one town to the next, like you might not make it.
Yeah. Robert, what are your opening thoughts on using supplies in a survival context?
I think the theory or the idea of it is more romantic than the actual implementation. Like I actually like video games where I have to track arrows because I like watching my supply and I've been finding that barrel and finding some more arrows. And so then I think like, oh, in a RPG, it's going to be great. But I think that it's kind of like encumbrance, right? It seems like it'd be interesting to do, but
That's a good
game
example.
every game I've been a part of where we've tried to like do encumbrance, it kind of peters out. And the same thing, I started running Tomb of Annihilation, thinking this is gonna be great. They're gonna be in the jungle, I have to track stuff. Then I get a ranger in there. He's like, oh, like I've got this plus, whatever. Just for my survival, I can find. So it kind of becomes, inconsequential. Or they get to like, the cleric, because Dark Sun, typically doesn't have like divine stuff. But then you get a cleric with create food and water, right? And it's like, oh, okay. Or you get the Goliath who's got like he can carry twice as much. So I find D&D is maybe not the best system to track supplies, and at least in that way of like accounting. But one idea I like, I think it was can't remember the game system, but it's more like a dramatic thing, right? Like, so maybe the idea would be that you don't track your arrows until you roll a 1 for your attack roll. Then you roll like a second one. If you roll, then you roll another d20. If you roll a second one, that was your last arrow. So I think maybe another way of doing it would be maybe more when it's dramatically appropriate, or could be a way of approaching it differently than just the accounting idea.
That's a lot more interesting, yeah. Or just have almost, I guess at that point you almost have like critical fumbles or something, but maybe not quite as horrifyingly disastrous. That's a good point about Ranger, and in fact, that was a complaint I think that ended up making the baseline 5e Ranger underpowered for a lot of campaigns, because they tried to bake all of this like more esoteric exploration stuff into the class, and you realize that a lot of people don't play with that pillar or emphasize that pillar, or otherwise just don't really utilize it in that mechanical viewpoint. It's more of this exploration, like, yeah, you're going to travel here and whatever, give me a survival check, versus the Rangers, like, oh, I know this land, I can track everything. It's hard to make that feel important when everybody else just has very concrete, like, no, here's what I can do in combat, here's what I'm going to do every round. And it's funny that instead of making exploration more interesting, they just made the Ranger more of a combat person in D&D. That's kind of a side topic, though. We could probably have a whole thing about the Ranger. Opening thoughts on survival, Scalenia.
I think it's an important thing to have as a session 0 conversation to see if your players want to focus on that or not. I can't say any of the games that I've run, anybody's been super excited about tracking resources. I think it helps tell the story in the early levels, kind of showcase what the experience is. But as the characters level, usually you can level out of survival and
I think that's what
tracking.
I think that's kind of what Robert was saying too, because you can do like create food and water, and druids get good berry that literally just like solves all of those issues. It's like we can solve this entire element of gameplay with a spell slot a day or something. That almost go ahead.
Which, if you play it right, I mean, that's showing the characters how cool they are.
Yeah,
it's showing what they've come to progress through, and then you can focus on different aspects of the story. But it's got a time and a place, and certain campaigns do it better. I think we already mentioned the Tomb of Annihilation, and then Icewind Dale probably has some of it. But it's hard, for like you guys who've gone back to back from TOA to Icewind Dale, for that to be an exciting part of the story.
Yeah. Stan, opening thoughts on survival and supplies.
A lot of people have already hit a lot of this. Depends on what you're, are you playing a beer and pretzels game? This isn't probably going to be your thing. If you're playing something that's a little darker, grittier or something, hey, this might be your jam. I've played a little bit, as Glennia was saying, it works out really well to your lower level characters. It's one of the reasons Good Berry is one of the most banned spells in the game. If you're trying to run, I mean, it's a first level spell. Yeah. So you're banning that off in session 0 if you're going to be trying to do any sort of supply survival. I had that's one of the reasons one of the characters I had in a game acquired a quiver of Elhana as fast as they could, went into town and bought every single arrow the town had, and just put 80 arrows into this quiver, and it's like, I'm not counting. It's like,
yeah,
we're done. We're done.
You'll have to remind, what is the quiver? Is it enchant the arrows?
It's kind of a bag of holding, but for missile weapons.
Ammunition only. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can have a couple different magic bows, a couple spears, and every arrow the town has in your quiver, because they knew they were going to be going out in the wilds. And she goes, I'm not running out of ammo.
Like, no, you're not, because I'm not tracking it.
It's like, all right. But some older editions actually had this baked in a lot more. I play in a 3.5 campaign, and the DM, he tracks how many arrows you have.
Wow.
He tracks your rations. It's 3.5 it's all math. You've got pluses for this, minuses for this, and 5e is much more story based, and it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in with this version of the game very well. Where 3.5, it's baked in.
So I know for resting, I think the rules say that you're supposed to have food. I'm trying to look at the rules. It's not in the rules. It just says
Supposed to
light.
have a pound of food a day, I think.
Okay, yeah, that's a I was looking at the resting section. So yeah, you eat 1 pound of food per day, and you can make food last longer by subsisting on half ration. So I'm looking. I flipped through the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook looking for any kind of notes or sections on survival elements. The Player's Handbook is basically just has a few notes about food and water, which is, hey, if you go without food for a number of days equal to 3 plus your con modifier, and at the end of each day beyond that, you gain a level of exhaustion. Exhaustion is kind of the default, like, the one system you have, and in fact, we talked about that for DM Roundtable not too long ago, which is fine, I think. And then water's got a similar one, but water's straight up the character who drinks only half a gallon per day, or 2 gallons per day if the weather is hot, must succeed on DC 15 con saving throw or suffer a level of exhaustion. So, has anybody played with those rules specifically for food and water? Like, I guess rations. Has anybody done rations with consequences? Yeah, it didn't seem. I started.
We did rations in our Dark Sun campaign, but
okay.
it was made irrelevant by leveling and spells and stuff, and foraging. I guess hunting.
Yeah, foraging.
Most of my experience.
Go ahead.
My games, that's what ends up happening. Foraging, they ask to forage and they roll a survival check, and then, they're usually able to get enough food for that day.
It seems just almost perfunctory at that point. Like, just like, yeah, I feel like we could just assume that. I mean, I guess if you wanted to lay down the hammer and really have specific modifications to the base rules, and like Stan was saying, having to ban good berry and some of these spells and make forage more interesting, but otherwise it just feels like it's almost a gimme. With it even says food and water, if it's abundant food and water sources, a DC 10 to forage. If there's limited food and water, it's a DC 15. You got to imagine somebody with a decent survival check at least, and then you could end up with very little food and water sources, like an Icewind Dale or something, and actually try to make it more extreme weather conditions.
Yeah, I think there's also the Outlander background where I think they can like find food for themselves, and it's like 4 or 5 other people. So something can even just take that background and then make it
Just automatic.
Yeah,
so you don't have to worry about that. And I thought resting required rations, but maybe I'm thinking of a video game that did that. Maybe Neverwinter Nights or something. Or no, well, I know Solasta did that too. So what's funny is Solasta is a video game that came out, RPG, came out a couple months ago, that very specifically did 5e rules. And initially I thought the way they did resting was pretty good, because one problem you have with all these D&D video games is they just let you fucking rest whenever you want without any consequences. They don't really keep track of, like, I guess the Pathfinder games do keep track of time in that way, but a lot of other games I've played, older ones like the Baldur's Gate and stuff, I don't really think they give a shit about the time, how much time passes. So you can just basically do the, like, oh, I'm going to fight and then go back and rest. I'm going to fight and go back and rest. And that's kind of a problem in D&D in general. And the way Solasta fixed that is by saying, okay, you have to have a ration, unit of ration, whatever, for every character. And those things were fairly limited supply. They were fairly heavy as well to carry. So the idea was you could only carry so many without it being just up, and it didn't encumbrance too, which is a pain in the ass. So it was kind of a pain, but I appreciated it because it limited the rest mechanic, at least in the early game. I couldn't feel like I had to rest all the time because I actually was tracking my rations. And so in that way, and this is specifically a video game, but it was a 5e video game, I was thinking, okay, this is actually effectively limiting my ability to cheese the system and constantly rest, because I know I've got only this many rations, and also made rations a very interesting reward for coming across in a dungeon, because it was like, oh, I looted a rest out of this chest, which is kind of interesting. And then, as we've mentioned, it goes to shit once you get to like level 3 in that game. I think I didn't have access to Goodberry, but you get it's not, they have the SRD, so they don't have the exact stuff from 5e, but you had something that was equivalent to create food and water, and it was basically just, that's all you needed. Once you had that, that part of the game was over. Like you could officially just have your one. I had a cleric, and that one cleric could just cast that spell every single rest. And on top of that, I would occasionally, forage while traveling. And now all of a sudden, it was back to like, oh, I can rest whenever I want. Doesn't matter. So once again, like the spell casting just kind of fucks that system up completely, which is, I think, is too bad because there was something there at least in the beginning of that game.
Right. Well, actually, Celasta has the good berry spell too.
Yeah, I just didn't have a dark
range.
class. Yeah.
Yeah, so I took that one, so I was like, "Oh, okay."
Didn't even worry about it.
I wasn't, but again, the irony is, I would have thought that was kind of cool. Like, I like that kind of stuff, and I think that's earlier editions. I think Sam's mentioned 3.5. Like in 3.5, I remember like they had like masterwork weapons and stuff, or it was like everything wasn't just about magic. So we would literally, like in 3.5 games, when we killed enemies, we would take their weapons and stuff and their armor, and we would be selling it. Right? It was more of a basic like thing, and I think in 4th edition and 5th edition, it is more like people don't, it's not worth it to try to scavenge like, weapons and stuff. And I think unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but I think part of that too is the whole survival. It kind of, it's a different, like the base D&D game doesn't really, kind of support that. So someone has to sort of like, add it on, I think, in their own way if they want it.
I'm okay with that streamlining of it. I did find enough pain in video games where it's like, oh, I gotta loot all these goblins like spears and shields and go sell them for 2 gold. Like I'd almost feel like just convert this into gold when it goes in my inventory. Like I don't care. It's gonna be a pain. At least Lost did the thing where they're like, you can leave everything in the dungeon and this other crew comes in and picks all the shit up off the floor and sells it for you. That was pretty tight. That's actually something everybody should implement in their D&D games. There's
that's first and second edition right there, man.
Yeah, it's like kind of a hireling kind of faction that was like, hey, once you clear the dungeon, we'll send our like fucking troops in there to just literally Roomba all the shit off the floor, and then we'll sell it to you. We take a little bit off the top, and it was a fucking sweet deal.
Dungeon Cleaners 305.
Yeah.
Local.
So to get off or unless somebody had something to talk about rations specifically, I guess the other thing we can look at is survival in terms of extreme conditions, which I know is going to overlap a little bit with the exhaustion talk because exhaustion is usually the go-to. Do any of you use or had to have campaigns in extreme weather conditions where it mattered in terms of you had to stay warm, you had to be able to start fires, or you had to have the right cold weather gear, or I'm trying to think what the equivalent of being hot, I guess just water, I guess from the Dark Sun campaign would be it, but anything like that besides James's Dark Sun campaign?
Few things terrify my players more.
Give me some examples.
So playing Continuing Tyranny of Dragons, and I do a little bit of looting and pillaging from Rime of the Frost Maiden and stuff. They're terrified of the cold because I straight up warned them. It's like, you guys go overboard in the boat heading out into the sea of moving ice. About every 2 rounds, you guys are making saving throws and you're going to be taking exhaustion. And I mean, these are like level 11 characters, and they're scared spitless of getting wet. It's like, there's nope. No one wants to be in the water. No one takes any risks when it comes close to being in the water. They're, trying to buy potions of cold resistance and rings of warmth and everything they can, because that's the one thing that scares them. It's like they can roll past almost any type of a combat encounter, but they don't mess with the weather.
Do you up the DC? Because it's like default DC 10 for extreme cold.
Probably running a 15 for the water.
Okay. It's interesting that exhaustion does not scale, so it's just as scary at every level, basically, in terms of being debilitating.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the fact that I think you only cure 1 level when you long rest, technically, so it can be very nasty when compounded.
Or it's like, what, a 5th level greater restoration?
I think greater, has to do it.
Yeah. It hurts.
Yeah. Are there rules about, like, if you had the right gear or something, you get advantage on that?
If they've got a ring of warmth, or have taken a potion of cold resistance or something, yes, yeah. I'd give it. But your gear, the way I look at D&D, they don't have diving gear per se. So, when you're hitting, this is the equivalent of Arctic. Salt water's a lot colder than fresh water before it freezes. So if you're in the sea of moving ice, that water might be 32 degrees. And you hit that, it simulates, kind of like the movie Titanic. You got people going into hypothermia. People are freezing solid while they're still in the water. So you got problems.
Do you put them in combat? Because you mentioned every round or something they have to make a save.
As spoilers for Tyranny of Dragons, there is some not so random encounters when you're on the boat of Marrow coming in, hitting you with the harpoons and pulling you overboard. So there's that. There's a few other combat encounters that are designed to literally rock the boat.
Okay, well that's the other thing is put them in combat in that situation. In terms of adventuring gear, do we care about any of this? I'm just gonna kind of throw this out there as a topic. Like page 150 on the player's handbook, they list literally dozens of items. I guess part of this just gets into the role play nature of it. But to me, the ones that really mainly come up, obviously potions, but rope seems to be the one thing, and you just kind of almost assume everybody's got a rope because I think most characters start off with one as part of their, whatever it's called, Dungeoneers pack. But otherwise, I don't remember the last time I tracked, I don't know, oh, you can't light a torch because you ran out of torch, because those are supposed to be quantified technically. Or you can't start a torch because you don't have a tinderbox. Or you can't get a proper rest because you don't have a tent. Does anybody care about any of that?
It depends on the... Go ahead, you first.
I was part of a campaign where there's a supplement out there, unofficial, for starting at 0 level. So we had a DM who took a first edition D&D adventure, and there's a thing where you get shipwrecked. So you basically start with nothing, and we did 0 level characters, not even having classes, and so it was kind of fun. But now we're up to 5th level, and that's kind of far in the background. And so I think on a regular campaign, I probably wouldn't care or track it. And it was just kind of like a one-off, kind of a unique way to start it. But in general, no.
But did that affect your gameplay, I guess, that you didn't have, I don't have torches and rope and stuff, and when you finally were able to get that stuff, did that matter? I guess I'm trying to decide if that's something that mattered in the grand scheme of the game.
At the beginning, yeah, I mean, it definitely mattered at the beginning. It was kind of cool because we had we were a carpenter or a glover or so we didn't have classes, so we were actually, it was occupation. So at the beginning it was kind of fun, and it kind of developed our characters' personalities down the road, like who we were. Usually that's just kind of a background thing, but so I think at the beginning it was fun, and it was it still wasn't it still wasn't super gritty. It wasn't like we were finding one dagger and fighting over it. It was still kind of stuff started to come fairly quickly. It was just fun, at least to start with, nothing at all, and just try to figure things out. But again, it was more of this is just a limited experience, and doing a whole campaign like that, I don't know. I think it would have got kind of tiring after a while.
Yeah, I can see we're having a special introduction, especially which one is it? Out of the Abyss. I guess spoilers for Out of the Abyss. That one, that campaign starts with the players as prisoners in the Underdark. So I think you start off with, I assume, nothing in that one, nothing but manacles. It might have a thing where there's a chest nearby where you've got all the starter gear in there or something, just to make things convenient. But that would be, I think, a good way of doing it. I don't know if it's funny because I feel like when I first started learning D&D, which really wasn't until 5th edition, and I'm looking at all these things going, oh, there's all these different items and uses and things, and I guess it just comes up to the campaign, but it feels like only really the rope, even the focus, we forget about most of the time. I guess again, it's just kind of a role-playing thing. Like
I think that's it. It's a role playing thing.
Yeah, I guess they
And
kind of
you
all
can
are.
you can encourage your players to lean into those items.
Yeah.
You know, going, carrying over into our inspiration conversations and stuff before of, hey, you've got this equipment, use it, surprise me, get creative. If you've got this particular item and you want to use it, great. I can, that gives me an opportunity to give you inspiration because you're using these things creatively. You're solving problems without using a spell, without killing everything in the room.
Yeah.
It's I've got a couple players that they're more than willing to use rope to kind of create tripping hazards or use some of the other items that they have because it's a creative option. And to them it's a more fun story than just using the brute force, smash button, kill monster thing.
That's very true.
Yeah, I think it's a role playing thing too. Like whenever I roll a character, I always get one of the packs or kits, just because I want to get something that based on what my character would have. And there's usually like one or two like fun, unique items that I can find a creative use for.
Yeah, I do like that. To use an example from our Rime of the Frostmain campaign, Valravan's always got a book and quill, and he's always actually writing, his stuff down in his book. And I don't know if that's part of his actual inventory he started with, but I just like the aesthetic. that's part of his character design. Is he's trying to create this epic narrative novel he's writing, and that's how he's giving out inspiration and casting spells.
The book is 25 gold in the player's handbook.
Wow, that's no joke. Pittance, that's another item that gets used a lot.
Take resources away at some point, or at least like have a big chance for them to be taken away. If they're canoeing and they go through a set of rapids, it's the chance that if they have skill challenge that fails, it's the chance that they lose their resources. They don't care about them until suddenly they do care about them. Because we've not had to make a big deal about it, but now they don't have them, so now it's a new problem for them to solve. For some things, stuff like rope that everybody has.
Right, yeah. It feels weird to be like, oh, you lost your magic axe. Like, that feels like fucking awful, but I could see where you're like, oh, but you actually lost all of your, like, adventuring gear, and there's a chasm up ahead.
They let the pack float down the river because they're not going to let go of their +1 sword. So.
Yeah. Sword's not going to get you across that chasm.
That could make an upper level character automatically start caring about rations then.
Yeah.
That's definitely one of the reasons that I like to just kind of randomly throw it in. And then there's stuff like Tomb where they've done the insect repellent. Nobody in the 2-3 games that I've been running with Tomb of Annihilation really made a big deal about it. They would just buy like 2 or 3 of them at the very beginning. Well, they don't realize it's a big deal until they run out. And then they can't make a 2-week trip back without having the. I don't know. It's one of those things where I think it's there for more dramatic purposes, but otherwise, I think most of us just assume that it's taken care of. It's one less thing that we all have to keep track of.
I think it's just part of like, hey, if you're a level 1, even if you're a level 1 adventurer, like, you know how to stay alive in the wilderness, at least to some extent. You know how to bring your own sandwiches and stuff. What was the stuff in Tomb? Stan, you mentioned the fact that I used some survival stuff in Tomb. What was, do you remember, like, specific?
Environmental stuff.
There was candles. There was a bug tent.
Yeah, you have everything from the monkey mist, the mad monkey mist, to the school of quippers. If you fall in the river, i.e. piranha. You had a lot of different environmental challenges that they would have to go through. Even just making it hard for them to get a long rest is making it survival.
That was the big thing that I think has been the most successful, and one that I took into this campaign and possibly future campaigns from now on, is the fact that this is probably a topic for resting, but specifically, but that's to do with survival also, but to the fact that you don't automatically get the benefits of a full long rest while resting in the wilderness. And that was a big key to making the Tomb hex crawl work, because otherwise you end up with that same complaint I mentioned earlier with the D&D video games is you can just, if you're resting all the time, then random encounters don't really mean anything. And not only that, but it makes the it probably unbalances things for the classes that have all these spectacular abilities they can do in a limited basis per day. But if you're giving them one challenging thing to do per day, at least while they're hex crawling, then those classes are just going to outshine the other ones. So my solution to that was to say, okay, you just don't get the benefits of a long rest anymore. And I don't remember if I had modified rules or if I just let people basically get short rests.
Yeah, it was just short rest.
It was a short rest. Okay.
You had to be in a quote safe location,
okay,
a fortified location, to get a long rest.
And I feel like I balanced it enough to where I never had them like really in dire straits too badly. And it was really only tier 1 anyway, which the only bad thing about that entire campaign that I will complain about to this day is the fact that I do think I stretched out too many sessions for those low levels. But that's because the jungle was default balanced for tier 1. But I tried to make it so they would at least hit their destinations, and then once they got to a destination, they could long rest there. There was one or two, like I think they meant like lizard folk ranchers at one point or something, where I had to like insert a safe zone for them because they needed that long rest and they weren't going to get one if I didn't give them something. So it's kind of per the DM's discretion in terms of when to give that to them. But I think that worked out really well in terms of we're basically going to turn the entire jungle into one big dungeon, essentially, that's like going from point A to point B versus... because otherwise you just long rest every single hex, and that I think just does not work.
And those long rests take away the threat of exhaustion.
That's true too. Yeah, because you can automatically heal 1 level each time.
Right. So
yeah.
unless you got someone that's stuck in my case, stuck in the water for 3 rounds, and they're taking 2 levels of exhaustion, then they really start to panic. But because 1 long rest isn't going to fix it.
Yeah. Versus
but
in good.
No, just compared to other things of, oh, you took 1, well, I'm going to rest, so who cares?
Yeah. And then in this campaign, yeah, we went ironically from one extreme situation, environmental region situation, to another. But it wasn't a hex crawl. It wasn't like it takes you 10 miles to go this little bit. It's everything is within, except for, I guess. Well, now we're going to start getting into it. Before, it was pretty short jaunts around, so it didn't really come up in terms of going around 10 towns. But once we finally started leaving the 10 towns area and exploring a little bit further, we did get farther. And I think in one specific time, I gave the players like a partial long rest. So I said, okay, you can get your long rest resources back, but you don't automatically heal. Instead, you have to like spend hit points like you're short resting, I believe. It was kind of a halfway compromise to that, because again, it's just, I think DM discretion, you just kind of have to gauge like where the players are at and see what they've got coming up, essentially. And I think going into that, at that point, they still had all of Sunblight to go, and I was like, this is a major fucking dungeon they're about to get to. They don't know it's a big dungeon, and it's just a pain in the ass if they decide, oh, let's just turn around, go all the way back to 10 towns, rest, come all the way back, or whatever they need to do. So I just kind of gave that to them. But otherwise, I would definitely recommend making some kind of to make wilderness survival work. Yes, you can still do the extreme, cold or extreme heat or whatever, harsh hazards and weather effects you want to have. But I think changing the resting rules is probably going to be the single most impactful and meaningful change you can make to actually have that overland travel matter. But don't be careful about doing that. It has to be something you give it to them right at the beginning. That's a session 0 talk about how our overland travel is going to work. I think the travel has to warrant it. I don't know if it would be worth doing, at least the extreme one I did for Tomb, that's probably not worth doing if they're just going around the Sword Coast or something. That was obviously a unique situation. And even in Rime, they've got a wagon they're traveling in, so that kind of affords them some protection. And then in Tomb, about this, to circle back around to when we talked about spells kind of solving a lot of problems, they got Leomin's Tiny Hut at level 5, and that basically completely eliminated the entire wilderness survival challenge that they were in, because you've instantly just got a pop-up Airbnb to just chill in as whenever you want. It's a ridiculous spell. But at that point I was kind of okay with it, and I guess that's why the hex crawl was scaled to level 1 through 4, because once you really get to third level spell slots and get Tiny Hut, you can just kind of eliminate a lot of. I mean, you can still do the, during the day we got to get through quicksand or whatever, but then literally any danger you throw at them, including exhaustion, will just get healed whenever they heal up at the Tiny Hut. So it almost becomes, okay, well, let's just montage the danger because we can talk about what's going to happen, but unless somebody's literally going to die, they're just going to heal up anyway for the next actual meaningful like event location I have. So I guess the whole resting thing just makes Overland Travel more complicated in D&D.
Did you forego the getting lost mechanic in Tomb?
Yes, that's a good question. I basically did. In the very beginning I didn't. I had rules set. An example of I had rules set up for all this, but I pretty quickly realized like there's so much content that I want to throw at them, and even if they take the best possible path to each location, which I basically gave them the locations they needed to get to. At one point I think they had to go to Mabala, and then from there they got like multiple, it was basically the climbing the Zelda Tower, and they could see multiple locations on their map. So they weren't ever just traveling in the dark, so they always kind of knew where they were going. But I pretty much dropped the lost rule, the getting lost rules, because it just did not seem fun at all. It just like, what's the point of that if it's just going to eat up more time, and if I'm not tracking resources, then I just have to throw more encounters at them. And I felt like even if they took the best possible path they could take to each location, there was still going to be plenty of encounters to throw at them to wear them down in a reasonable way. So ultimately, I didn't think it was going to make it more interesting or more fun. It would have made it, I guess, more challenging, but that wasn't necessarily what I was looking for. So I
think length of game session matters too.
That's very true. I'm not running 4 or 5, 6 hour games.
Right. Where, as we've talked before, I tend to run a short game for me is 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have more opportunities to do something like that than you will in a 2 to 3 hour session.
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing, because I realize I'm actually in the minority when it comes to that, because every time I see somebody describing like it's a one shot or it'll take 2 sessions, and it's like, this is 6 hours or 7 hours or 8 hours, and I'm like, oh, that's we actually, like, I have to double everything basically whenever they say it, because I do try to. Pacing is a big deal for me as somebody who obviously is running a live show, but also is just very aware of just, I think, our attention spans collectively, and the fact that it's Friday night after a week of working and kids and all that. Just we try to keep it under a reasonable time at that point. We had longer sessions for Tomb with an intermission in the middle, and that's something I do think is working better for our current campaign in Rime, where we don't go as long, but we also don't have an intermission. So I think pacing wise it works a little bit better, even if we ultimately lose like whatever it is, 15 minutes or something. So yeah, it's probably close to like, I think we average 2.5 hours in Rime, and I think we average like 2:45 in Tomb. But yeah, that's probably a reason why I'm usually biased about not tracking a lot of things, or worrying about a lot of these topic that we're talking about right now, the keeping track of a lot of these supply issues and all that. It's just, does it make things more entertaining or interesting, or is it going to just bog the game down and slow everything down and be more cumbersome? Which, if the answer is yes to the latter, then I'm very likely going to drop it. Encumbrance, very much easy to drop. I hate that in every game. It's a pain in the ass. I don't want to play, Tetris inventory, or worry about the little encumbrance bars or anything on the characters and pass stuff around. That's just awful. So I think that's an easy thing to drop as well. Go ahead.
Oh, I agree. I was just thinking, like, the idea of movies, right? Like, the idea of making a movie is you cut out everything that's boring, only putting stuff in that's really making the story go forward. And I think, that's kind of yeah, you could like track every single piece of encumbrance, every single piece of equipment, every, gallon of water. But then, is it really in the long run making the story more interesting, or is it just making bookkeeping? So I think, limited situations or special moments, it could help. But I think overall, it's probably, doesn't contribute a lot.
Right, like I know if we loot, there's a treasure chest with I don't know 1,000 gold pieces in it, and I know the players can't physically carry all that gold. I'm not gonna go through the motion of like, okay, well, you're gonna have to leave and go get a cart and bring the cart down here, or hire some people, or do let's just montage all that. Like, look, you've got the money, whatever it takes. Like, you got the money. We don't care. Like, you got your loot. It's a lot of more. I guess there's certain other video games that just kind of cheat that system where they just don't care about encumbrance or anything, and that's why like that movie pacing is we just want to stick to the fun stuff.
I think it sucks that they made some of the Rangers' abilities like based on that kind of
Yes.
travel survival mechanics. So when you ignore the rules because it sucks for everyone else, and then it just kind of nerfs the Ranger.
Yes, that's why. Yeah, the Ranger was very underpowered and not well, and was I think the least well-regarded class in 5e because of that. Because that whole pillar and section was underdeveloped, and a lot of people either ignored it or kind of fast or streamlined it, whatever else. And then the Ranger just felt like, well, that's a big part of my class baked in that doesn't really matter. Whereas other class, and a big part of D&D is obviously combat, and all the other classes have like, oh, I'm getting cool shit at this level I can do during combat, and the Ranger's like, oh, I can run in the forest better or something, that really doesn't end up coming into play very often. And that's why I believe it was Tasha's came out with a lot of those variant rules for all the classes, but importantly for the Ranger specifically, shoring up a lot of those abilities and trying to make them a little more universally good versus very just extremely niche.
Yeah, before, like, if I was going to join a Tomb campaign, I'd say, okay, I'm going to make this cool, like, jungle hacking Ranger to, get the party and make sure we don't get lost and make sure we don't run out of resources. But then, like, if they just, like, oh, we're not going to worry about any of that stuff.
Yeah. Like, well, fuck me, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely think it's important to convey all that information in the session 0, though. That way you don't have players coming in expecting either to track all that or expecting, like me, I would come into a game and expect not to have to worry about all that. And if some DM was like, oh, by the way, we're going to be tracking rations and arrows and shit, I'd be like, oh, well, crap. Maybe not for me then.
Do you feel like I know part of it's going to be your lack of interest because you mentioned that you don't like to keep track of your arrows in video games. But like Roll20 has an ammo tracking macro where you can tag it and it'll kind of keep track of the stuff. And I'm a big fan of that side of it for like ammunition, like something you're going to need to have. Only in the sense of like, for the most part, the way we'd handle it is you'd shoot an arrow, and after the fight, you could roll a D4 to see how many arrows you get back, right?
I think
how many you can pull out of people's heads.
You guys did that in Storm King.
Yes, thank you. We did that in Storm King because Raymond was always like, I need to get some arrows back.
Yeah. And the idea is that most of the time you don't really run into that situation, but like as you get down to like the last 6, right? Like it's like a little bit more tense because my first character was a ranger, a beastmaster ranger, because I didn't know anything about D&D at the time, and it was one of those things where I loved him, I still love him, and the ammo tracking part of it with Roll20 is super easy, and I think it's way more fun on a virtual tabletop than if I'm at a table with pen and paper. Trying to keep track of.
Do you need extra? Do you need extra API scripts for that, or can you do it just straight in the 5e sheet?
So in 5e sheet, it's just part of it. But what I've noticed is that I have to restart the sandbox thing a lot. As they do updates on the back end of Roll20, a lot of times that's one of the things that breaks.
It'll break
on the sheet. Yeah.
I feel like we did ammo tracking. Maybe it was Storm Kings then. I don't know if we started with Tomb too. I feel like we almost did do that at one point, but we still kind of just dropped it at some point where it's like even this.
Well, again, I mean, you're not a big fan of it, so why would you run a game that's got that as a feature? But I know that's one of the benefits for players who are on virtual tabletops. It just, I'll be honest, virtual tabletop stuff makes it so easy. I think you've referenced it before about how different an in-person game is.
Yeah.
They both have their merits, but for something like this, I think you can streamline, because the Tomb of Annihilation, the Lost rules and the exploration rules, I was using a macro that I click one button, it does all the rules for me, and then I can just narrate what's happening as a result of that. Whereas the in-person game, I kind of just gloss over most of it now. And to be fair, they have leveled up to level 6, and so they've just recently got like these cool abilities. One of the barbarians picked a like totem of the elk or something, where he can move twice as fast. And then the Gloomstalker Ranger changed his second favored thing to jungle instead of just forest. So it's really like narratively just dismissed all of the travel stuff that we've been dealing with, and now we get to go from cool encounter to cool encounter instead.
Yeah, I think they could feel good if that's something they earn. It feels more earned, I guess, at that point.
I will say that Reese and Thimbleweed are very grateful that you do not keep track of ammunition.
Dude's firing arrows left and right. I will say, if it's a limited quantity magic item, then we keep track of that shit. Because at one point I gave him Chardalyn tipped arrows that did extra shit. And I was like, I think he might have rolled for him actually and had like 3 or 4. And at one point I said like, all right, how many arrows you got left? Because I really was like, these are, like potions. Like I do want people to keep track of important finite magic items. I just, specifically like mundane arrows, I don't know. I just feel like I like games where you just can default to always being able to shoot your shit. But if it's specifically a magic, and if it's magic arrows, those should be a limited quantity, I feel like. Just like potions and stuff. So those I do obviously require people keep track of. That's the important caveat there. Anything else about survival and supply tracking? I'm still not convinced to probably ever use it unless I was running a specific survival campaign, I think, which Dark Sun would be a cool one to do. Still waiting for Wizards to use some of those other properties, something that's not Magic Gathering, I guess.
Or even bring back some of the stuff outside the Sword Coast, like the Anarok Desert. They touched on that in the Storm Kings.
Yeah, that's true.
You're there for one encounter and you're done.
There's a whole fucking continent to explore, and they can't get out of the Sword Coast. Yeah, we've gone extreme north with Icewind Dale and extreme south, I believe, with Schult.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, not much else. That could be another topic right there. The areas we want to see explored in the Forgotten Realms or just other properties. All right, let's do our final thoughts for this topic, survival and supplies. We're going to go bottom to top this time. So Stan, give me your final thoughts on this topic.
It can be interesting if everybody's on board. If they're not on board, we're going to default to storytelling and not accounting.
Scalenia, final thoughts on survivals and supplies.
I think it requires a lot more work for the DM to bring the energy to make it fun and exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Make it a reason to keep track of.
Robert, final thoughts, please.
I would just say something to use sparingly, and maybe when there's certain dramatic moments to bring it in.
Genocider, final thoughts.
I think if you're going to do it, it's got to be like a central part of the campaign. Like not just running up and down on the Sword Coast and running out of food, water, and arrows. It's got to be like a survival campaign.
I would agree with that. I think having a survival focused campaign where actual like physical survival is a feature and a big focus, and you've got rules baked in from the beginning and you obviously convey that in session 0 would probably be the way that I would want to do it. Otherwise, I ain't tracking shit of these mundane items. But like Stan said, I think encouraging players to use them in fun role-playing ways, they want to whip out their candles and their iron pots and cook food or whatever, fucking go for it. I think that's fun. And that's probably what those items ultimately should do, is just give you a fun idea of, items you can use. And same thing with loot, like give your players fun little trinkets or just random shit, and, they might put it in their pack and forget about it, as is sometimes the case with my players, or it might become this, beloved 3-foot grabber arm that a player absolutely adores and uses all the time. So anything can be a fun, magical piece of equipment, I suppose. All right, I think that's going to do it for this month's DM Roundtable. Thank you to Genocider, Robert Sklinia, and Stan for joining me, and thank you to all of the patrons. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Thomas, Adam, Stan, Nathan, William, I'm Loud, Al, Kyle, Sklinia, Genocider, David, and Jammin' Clams. Gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, James, and Perry. Thank you all very much for your support. Hope to see you all again for next month's DM Roundtable discussion.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.